Well, I'm here with Dr. Dana Ferris, renowned expert dealing with errors made by English language learners in their writing primarily. We've already talked today about some of the main issues, including types of errors and why these errors would be important to a learner and to a teacher. And in this segment, we'd like to talk about different ways that teachers could respond to student writing. And if you could just, before we get into the nitty-gritty of details of any of these, could you give us a general overview of what some of the different general techniques would be, or general types of teacher response would be?
Yeah, this is a good place to define a couple of terms that are in the literature about teacher feedback on error. And I'm going to talk about it in terms of three choices. So the first choice is comprehensive feedback versus selective or focused feedback. And comprehensive is just what it sounds like, where a teacher moves through a student paper marking every error pretty much of any type that the teacher notices. Selective or focused feedback, as the name implies, is where the teacher chooses a specific error types, specific error patterns to give feedback on, leaving the others unmarked. Okay, so that's one choice, is are you going to mark the papers comprehensively or selectively? Now with selective feedback, there are a couple of different ways that's approached. One is where maybe the teacher's been teaching lessons on verb tense and decides for all the students that she's going to mark all the verb tense issues and nothing else. So pre-selected category of errors or categories of error. The other approach would be to look at the student paper and say, I noticed this student has these 4 patterns of error that are really prominent, so I'm going to mark those in particular and leave the other ones unmarked. So comprehensive versus selective is the first choice. The second is direct versus indirect feedback. And the way this is defined in the literature is direct feedback occurs when the teacher actually provides the correct form for the student. So that can involve, for example, crossing out an unnecessary word, or crossing out a wrong word and writing in the right word, or adding a missing word ending, like a plural ending or a verb tense ending at the end of a word, just inserting that. Rewriting sentences. So there are various ways, depending on the type of error, to approach it, but the bottom line principle is that the teacher is actually making the correction for the student, providing the correct form. Indirect feedback is where the teacher indicates for the student that an error has been made, but does not provide the correct form, and rather asks the student to analyze and see what they can do to correct the error. Indirect feedback, again, has several forms. It could involve just underlining or circling or highlighting a word or a phrase that isn't correct. It could also involve including some sort of code, like maybe you circle spelling errors or put an arrow if words are out of order. Again, the key principle is that the teacher doesn't provide the correct form, but rather says to the student, there's a problem here, go back and try to figure out what it is and how to fix it. So that's the second one. The third choice is explicit versus implicit feedback. And that is where in explicit feedback, the teacher provides information about what type of error it is and perhaps even a rule reminder, like use past tense when you're talking about something that happened to you before now.
So the teacher actually writes this on the paper?
The teacher might write a little rule reminder, like you need past tense here, or it could be an error code like VT for verb tense or SP for spelling. But the key between that and less implicit feedback would be what I just mentioned, where maybe you just underline or circle an error, but don't tell them anything, give them any linguistic information about the type of error or about the rule. And so again, those are some choices, and we'll go on to talk about when and why a teacher might make one or more of those choices. But yeah, comprehensive versus selective feedback, direct versus indirect feedback, explicit versus implicit feedback. Those are three big choices that the teacher, in providing feedback, can put in context with other things going on in the class.
And do you find that teachers who maybe are just starting to deal with English language learners have a preference for one of those, or is there one that's sort of the fallback for many teachers?
That's a good question, and yes, I'd say without reflection on how to go about on these strategies, teachers will fall into comprehensive feedback. I think largely because we feel like we're not doing our jobs if we don't mark every single thing that's out there, and we tend to be more direct, crossing things out, writing things in, again because we sort of assume that students can't self-correct or they wouldn't have made those errors in the first place. So I'd say, yeah, comprehensive and direct are probably the most likely fallback default strategies that teachers might choose if they haven't really thought about it one way or the other.
Okay. And so having that menu of options now in front of us of different ways that we could make, the teachers could respond to student papers and student errors, I guess a question we should talk about is, we've already talked about what are some of the errors could be, which errors should be treated?
So which errors should be treated? And that question, in a sense, implies that the teacher has chosen to be selective rather than comprehensive. So if you're being selective, how do you decide which errors to treat and which to leave for another time? And so there are three different things the teacher might consider in deciding which errors to treat in a selective approach. One is serious or what are called global errors that interfere with reader understanding. So if there's a word choice error or a sentence construction error or some other kind of error where the reader literally can't tell what the writer means, that's obviously an important error to point out to the student. The main purpose of writing is communication to a reader. And if sentence level, word level errors are impeding a reader's comprehension, then that's a very serious error, and the student needs to know about that right away, probably before any other type of error is addressed. Local errors, which are smaller errors that don't necessarily impair comprehension, but that appear frequently or in patterns, are a good thing to point out to students. So if they make lots and lots of errors with noun plurals or verb tenses or comma splices or whatever it is, and you notice it over and over in a text, that can be a great pattern to point out, because you're sort of narrowing the universe, and instead of saying you've made 45 errors on a 2-page paper, you've said, well, you've made errors in these 3 patterns, and you can call specific examples to their attention and give them some rule reminders, or send them to a handbook or a website to study those rules, or however you want to address it. But you've made the task of editing and learning to improve more manageable for the student by pointing out patterns rather than a large diffuse collection of errors.
Which is overwhelming.
Which is overwhelming to the student.
Yeah.
And even if they go through and correct all of them, they may not learn anything generalizable to take into their future writing tasks. It can be overwhelming to the teacher too to mark all those errors.
Right. And you have an English language learner who is already facing a new language and is confused perhaps by the language that's happening around him or her. So pointing out, as you're saying, pointing out 45 different things is really not very helpful to that learner.
I still remember students I had in a writing class a few years ago where I took a fair amount of time to do an error analysis at the beginning of the course, where I went through and for each student pointed out between 2 and 4 patterns of error they might want to be aware of and work on during the class. And I spent a lot of time doing that error analysis, but I still remember my students were so grateful. And they said to me, you know, my teachers have told me my whole life that I make too many errors with my grammar and my writing, but you're the first person who's ever told me what those grammar errors are and what I can do about them. And it was an eye-opener to me that students really, they do appreciate and understand that kind of specific, detailed input, as long as it's not too overwhelming and too comprehensive. Now, a third type of error teachers might consider marking are what have been called stigmatizing errors. And these are errors that mark a writer as an English learner to real-world audiences. And I mentioned some typical English learner errors before: verb tenses, word choice errors, noun errors, things where a reader would say, that's an ESL student. And sort of depending on the reader, some readers might cut the student a break because they know they're still in the process of second language acquisition. Others might judge them more harshly, say, well, they're not competent users of the English language, so they shouldn't get that good score on the test, or they shouldn't get that job, or they shouldn't get into that college. And we don't want that. So things that particularly mark them as non-native speakers, those could be categories of errors that teachers might want to pay attention to as well. So obviously, serious errors, patterns of errors, stigmatizing errors, those are a lot of different errors to think about. And in the spirit of not wanting to overwhelm students, teachers are going to have to make some choices. You can't mark all of those for every single paper. So the teacher is going to have to carefully consider the task, the goals of the feedback at the time, and each individual student writer, what they need at that particular point in time.
And to me, this goes back to the issue you had raised earlier, which is the different types of errors that English language learners make. And I think it's really important for teachers who maybe aren't so familiar with English language learners and their kinds of errors they make to become familiar, as you said, sort of retool themselves, retrain themselves, that they need to find out what some of these typical errors are in order to help those learners overcome those issues.
I think that's important, and it's hard to tell teachers who are already working really hard and have a lot to do, yeah, you may need to retool or retrain or learn some new things, but we all do. I mean, those of us who are old enough to have seen what instructional technology has done to the classroom environment, we've all had to learn some new tricks. And so learning to get a handle on what some of these language issues are, teachers have to do that, because how are you possibly going to respond effectively to student writing or provide classroom instruction if you yourself don't even have at least a sense of what some of those issues might be?
Right. So we've talked about the different kinds of errors. We've also talked about different ways in general of working with those errors. Another question that I get asked a lot by teachers is, okay, I know what the errors are. I'm pretty good at judging now whether it's a serious error or not so serious. But when do I do something with these errors? Is there a good time? Is one time better than another in the writing process of dealing with these student errors?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's a controversial one too. There are many composition scholars and teachers who believe firmly that the only time to address errors is at the very end of a writing process, when a paper is nearly final. And there's some good arguments behind that. I mean, one argument is you want the student to do substantive revision of their content during the writing process. And if you prematurely focus them on errors, you might short circuit that revision process. It's also not a good use of the teacher's time to mark a lot of errors that might disappear in the revision process. That said, English learners need a lot of input about their language and their writing, and I think that they can benefit from attention to language issues and errors throughout the writing process. However, the focus of that attention should be different depending on the stage of the process. So, for example, early in the process, when students are writing a first draft or a second draft and the teacher's giving feedback, the teacher might focus most of their feedback on content and suggestions for revision. But might also say, as you revise, I've noticed a couple of patterns here. Pay attention to your verb tenses, pay attention to your commas, pay attention to your prepositions, whatever it is. You're missing some articles. So maybe pick out one or two things that you notice early on and maybe mark a few of them in a paragraph or two so that they have some examples. But don't go through line editing every single error throughout the paper, because you want them focusing on revision. But you've still not missed the opportunity to give them some language feedback at a part in the process where they can use it. Then when they're getting near the end of the writing process and about to finalize a paper, that's a great time either for more detailed feedback by the teacher and or in-class peer and self-editing workshops where you really focus on polishing up that final product. So that's where the most focused attention to error should be. But even after the paper is finalized, either for a grade or to go into a portfolio or whatever happens to that text, there's still room to give students feedback on how successful they've been or not been with their language, and ask them to do some follow-up work, some analysis or reflection on the errors that they've made and what they might do about those between now and their next paper. Some teachers do this through charting. Some people do it through analysis exercises where they pull out sample sentences from their final draft that have had errors in them and try to rewrite them and write a little analysis of what their errors are. So even at the very final stage, there are ways that the teacher can intervene so that the student gets maximum benefit from that writing experience, from that revision and editing process, and from the feedback they're getting from the teacher and other sources. Because again, the point is not just to fix a particular paper. The point is to teach them strategies and analysis skills that they can use for their future writing as well.
Something you mentioned that caught my ear just now was you said that something about the students and their writing as it's successful or not successful. And I think one thing that some teachers forget is that it's also good to make comments about what you've done correctly and
Yes.
positive feedback. And that treatment of error is really not just, as you said earlier, it's not just about finding all the errors and marking all the errors, but giving the students some positive feedback as well about things that they're doing correctly.
Absolutely. And especially if you see progress on something the student struggled with earlier, and you point that out, that can be very encouraging to the students. I think positive feedback is important for all aspects of writing, including error, but not limited to error. And I think teachers tend to just put their critical lens on when they read student writing and forget that this is a human being who's already struggling with this probably, or at least lacks confidence in it, and needs as much encouragement and reinforcement as they can get.
I think this is a good segue into our last part, which is what are some of the better ways to respond to student writing. So now we have identified what the errors are. We've talked about in general what you could do, but being a little more specific now, ways that teachers could respond to student writing.
Yes, I have based on what we've already covered, I have a few suggestions that teachers might consider when they approach this challenging task of deciding when and how and what to give feedback on errors. So just to sort of summarize this, research recommends that selective feedback early in the writing process, patterns of error, as we talked about, may be the most beneficial. At the very end of a writing process, if you want students to do analysis and charting, more comprehensive feedback about the errors that remain in a final draft may be appropriate. So there may be room at different stages in the writing process for selective and comprehensive feedback. There are some texts that students do pretty much have to get letter perfect, or as close to letter perfect as they can. Applications for schools and for jobs come to mind, but there are other examples like scholarship applications. So it's important sometimes to really focus comprehensively on what they need to do. So while selective feedback is less overwhelming, there may even be appropriate points for comprehensive feedback. Another piece of advice is to reduce the amount of teacher feedback as a term progresses, a course or a school year, and require more student involvement. If you've given them good feedback and given them some good strategies and analysis skills, put more responsibility on the students as time goes on to be self-editing and trying to improve with less and less intervention from the teacher. The day is going to come when they're going to have those skills on their own.
So more of an they're becoming independent writers.
Independent writers. Another piece of advice I mentioned briefly, but we haven't really talked about, is using peer and self-editing workshops to build student autonomy. A lot of students believe that the teacher is the only one who knows enough to give them any feedback, but it's not true. Peers really can be good readers for one another if they're trained and if the task is carefully structured. Students can be guided to do self-editing where they look through their text for patterns of errors that they know they're prone to, where they use good proofreading strategies. I think teachers tend to underestimate how much students can do with the right kind of guidance and structure. So the teacher should not be doing all the work of error feedback. Students should be doing their own self-editing, and they should be being helpful readers to one another. And
I hear you with the peer editing. I know in a lot of the writing classes I've done, or writing classes that I've watched as well, sometimes a teacher will just, the peer editing task will be something like turn to somebody near you and exchange papers and comment. And it's very unstructured, produces, in my experience, produces less than stellar results because the students themselves haven't been trained in what to look for. So I hear you when you're saying that it's the teacher's duty to help the student writers become better editors, become better at finding these kinds of errors, or better at just making comments on other students' papers.
Yeah, I agree. I think that modeling and training and even talking about the principles for good peer feedback and peer editing is really important. And then structuring the task to where it's doable and practical, not vague, like just, give each other comments on whatever. It can be very, very successful with the principles of modeling and structure. And accountability, I should add, where students know that the teacher's paying attention to how well they do on these peer editing activities so that they take responsibility and aren't just too nice to each other or don't take the task seriously. Another piece of advice is to combine direct and indirect feedback. I think most of us would agree that indirect feedback, which again is where students have to the teacher doesn't make the corrections for them, but indicates that an error has been made. In most cases, indirect feedback is going to have better long-term benefits for the students. And there's even been student survey research when students are given choices, they say, let me know where my errors are, but let me correct them myself. They understand that even though it would be easier for them, for the teacher to do all the correction, that they will learn more from doing it themselves. That said, there may be room for direct feedback under where the teacher makes the corrections under a couple scenarios. Lexical errors like prepositions where the students may not be able to self-correct just because of lack of language knowledge. Lower proficiency learners who don't have enough intuitions about the language yet to self-correct. If the teacher makes those direct corrections and then asks the students to rewrite the text, at least they've gotten some input of accurate language for their ongoing second language acquisition. So as students get more proficient, more indirect feedback probably helps them more, but there may be a role under certain circumstances for direct feedback.
An example of that I wanted to point out with a lot of teachers who aren't so familiar with some of the ESL issues with prepositions, are really hard, prepositions and articles, two really hard areas for learners to improve on. I run into the situation where, take the preposition in, for example, the book is in the box or on the box. That's kind of an obvious one. It's a lexical preposition. It's either in or on. But when students try to write a sentence such as, my uncle was very interested in going to the US Open, but they don't know to write interested in, so they write interested by or interested on or interested for. And I've seen where teachers sometimes will circle that and just put wrong preposition. Well, how would you know? How would you know that first it was wrong, and then how would you correct it? Except grab one of the other 80 prepositions out of the air.
Yeah, I agree. I think that some of those are idiomatic and either you know them or you don't, and just circling it and saying it's wrong doesn't help the student, whereas giving them the right form might actually, helpful, yeah. They might just remember it the next time.
Right.
Yeah. And then finally, just to revisit something that I mentioned, is ask students after receiving feedback to revise or rewrite their texts and or complete reflection or analysis exercises after they've received corrections. Teachers a lot of times with regard to feedback will complain a lot about how much work they put into marking student papers and how they feel like the students don't pay attention to their feedback and don't do anything with it, and then they have the same problems on the next paper. There's an easy solution to that. Make them do something with the feedback, whether it's rewriting the paper, whether it's charting their errors, whether it's rewriting sentences with errors, writing an analysis of their error patterns. You can do that as homework, you can do that as in-class exercises. There has to be some responsibility and accountability put on the learner. So if you make them engage with the feedback, they will benefit from it. But don't just leave that to chance.
Right. Could you talk about charting a little bit? That's a term that some people might not be so familiar with. With charting the learner errors, what would that look like?
Well, there are various ways charts could be constructed, but for example, let's say you've done some kind of error analysis with the students at the beginning of the term, and for each student you've picked out maybe 4 or 5 areas they might need to work on. You might create a chart or have the students create a chart where for each paper or each draft, they keep track of how many of those error types they make and how they can reduce those over time and how they fix them from one revision to the next. So there'd be maybe the columns with each draft or paper and then rows with each error type, and they might just chart how many of each error type they make over time. And at first the teacher might have to mark them, and then the students just count them up and put them on the chart. But over time you could release some of that work to them as they become more familiar with the categories and the error patterns.
So it's just to help students be able to visualize this sort of nebulous grammar or
Right.
errors.
It provides a kind of concrete visual, and it also, hopefully, if they're paying attention and they're thinking, oh yeah, on my chart I was paying attention to this particular thing, it might help them have those errors in mind when they're doing their writing, and it might encourage them as hopefully they see the number of errors go down, from text to text and over time.
Right.